There comes a point in life, often in the quiet aftermath of betrayal, failure, or abandonment, where you're forced to ask a question that shakes the very ground of your being. Do I even love myself? Not in the surface-level affirmations or mirror smiles, but in the raw honesty of solitude, shame, and silence. This isn't a question of ego, it's a question of survival. Because until you learn to love yourself more than anyone else ever could, you will be tossed in the waves of others' expectations, never anchored in your own truth. Stay with me through this message, not for inspiration, but for confrontation. Because what's waiting at the end isn't comfort, it's transformation. There is a wound in modern humanity that is rarely spoken of, but deeply felt. It lies beneath the surface of our striving, our performing, our pleasing. This wound is the abandonment of the self. It begins subtly, often, in childhood, when the gaze of others, parents, teachers, peers becomes the mirror through which we evaluate our worth. We are taught early on that to belong, to be loved, to be safe, we must contort, we must adapt, we must become acceptable. And in doing so, we begin to trade pieces of our authentic self for a counterfeit sense of approval. The child who was once uninhibited, curious, and emotionally honest begins to fracture. That which is rewarded is exaggerated. That which is punished is buried. Over time, the true self becomes obscured under layers of roles, expectations, and performance. But the psyche does not forget. The unconscious records every moment of self-betrayal, every instance where one said yes when their soul cried no, every time one laughed to conceal pain or stayed silent to avoid rejection. And this accumulation of inauthenticity breeds an inner conflict, a war between who we are and who we believe we must be. The more we neglect our true self in favor of the false persona, the more estranged we become from inner peace. We may succeed outwardly, receive praise, gain status, yet feel an emptiness that no external validation can fill. Because the soul does not care for applause. It longs for truth. It longs for wholeness. What we must understand is that the process of loving oneself begins not with affirmations or surface-level self-care, but with a radical confrontation of this disconnection. It requires one to descend into the depths of their psyche, to unearth the roots of this abandonment, and to reclaim what was lost. This is not an intellectual journey. It is emotional, spiritual, and often painful. Because to remember the self is to feel the grief of having forgotten it. It is to weep for the years spent in exile from one's own essence. But within this grief lies the seed of transformation. The pain becomes the path. The wound becomes the womb of rebirth. In this descent, we encounter the shadow, the hidden, repressed, and disowned parts of our being. Society has conditioned us to view the shadow with fear and disgust, to believe that what is dark within us is dangerous, shameful, unworthy. But this is a lie perpetuated by a culture that fears emotional depth and psychological complexity. The shadow is not evil, it is merely unseen. It holds the very parts of us that were once deemed unacceptably anger, our desires, our fears, our sensitivity. But it also holds our creativity, our intuition, our authenticity. When we repress the shadow, we do not eliminate it. We project it onto others. We fear in them what we dare not face in ourselves. And thus, our relationships become distorted mirrors, reflecting back the disowned aspects of our soul. To love oneself, then, is to turn toward the shadow with compassion, rather than judgment. It is to sit with the parts of ourselves we were taught to hide, and to say, "You are welcome here." This is not indulgence. It is integration. It is the process of becoming whole. Because we cannot truly love what we do not know, and we cannot know what we refuse to see. The journey of self-love demands that we reclaim every fragment of our being, not to justify harmful behavior, but to understand its origin, to heal its wound, to restore its place within the totality of who we are. The process of integrating the shadow is not a one-time event. It is a continuous practice, a daily willingness to confront the parts of ourselves that arise in discomfort. It shows up in moments of jealousy, irritation, anxiety, or avoidance. Instead of repressing or deflecting these experiences, we are called to examine them with curiosity. What is this emotion trying to reveal? What story does it carry? What part of me is asking to be seen? In doing so, we begin to replace shame with insight, fear with understanding. We begin to hold ourselves with the same tenderness we once longed to receive from others. And this brings us to one of the most deceptive illusions of the modern world. The belief that love must be earned from the outside. That our value is determined by how desirable, successful, or agreeable we are. This illusion keeps us trapped in cycles of performance and perfectionism. We learn to hustle for worthiness, to chase validation like a drug, believing that if only we are loved enough by others, we will finally feel whole. But this is a mirage. External validation is fleeting and conditional. It rises and falls with the moods and opinions of others. It is a poor substitute for self-acceptance. The deeper truth is that no one can give you the love you refuse to give yourself. Not a partner, not a parent, not a mentor, not an audience. Others can reflect your worth, but they cannot create it. They can support your growth, but they cannot anchor your identity. That task belongs to you alone, and it begins with the recognition that you are not broken, not lacking, not unworthy. You are simply disoriented, lost in a world that profits from your self-doubt, a world that teaches you to seek your reflection in others' eyes, rather than within your own soul. To withdraw from this illusion is to reclaim your power. It is to stop chasing and start becoming. It is to shift your attention from how others perceive you to how you perceive yourself. Are your thoughts kind? Are your boundaries clear? Are your choices aligned with your truth? These are the questions that matter, because self-love is not about being liked, it's about being real. It's about standing in the fullness of your being and refusing to apologize for it. And yet, this is easier said than done. For many, the idea of loving oneself feels foreign, even dangerous. There is fear that we will become selfish, arrogant, isolated. But this fear stems from a misunderstanding. True self-love is not narcissism. It is not inflated ego or superiority. It is the humble recognition that your life has intrinsic value, that your thoughts, feelings, dreams, and needs matter. That you are worthy not because of what you do, but because of who you are. And when you love yourself in this way, you do not take from others. You give more freely. Because love that flows from fullness is generous. It does not cling, demand, or manipulate. It simply is. The foundation of this love is built in solitude. In the quiet moments when there is no one to perform for, no role to play. In the stillness, you begin to meet yourself. Not as an image, but as a presence. You begin to listen not to the noise of expectations, but to the whisper of your own intuition. You begin to see not through the eyes of judgment, but through the lens of compassion. And slowly, gently, you begin to rebuild the relationship that was broken, the relationship with yourself. This rebuilding takes time. It requires patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to truth. It is not linear. There will be days of doubt, of regression, of pain. But these are not failures, they are invitations. Each setback is a teacher. Each trigger is a guide. The very things that make you feel unworthy are the keys to your liberation. If you can face them with honesty, they will reveal not your flaws, but your forgotten beauty. Because at the heart of all self-love is remembrance. A returning to what you already are. Beneath the layers of conditioning. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be whole. You are not here to be everything to everyone. You are here to be yourself. And in doing so, you give others permission to do the same. This is the revolution of self-love, not an escape from reality, but a deeper descent into it. Not a retreat into comfort, but an awakening into courage. And as you walk this path, you will begin to see the world differently. Not as a battlefield for approval, but as a mirror of your growth. Not as a place to lose yourself, but to find yourself again and again. Let me know when you're ready to continue with the next set of key points. There comes a point in life, often in the quiet aftermath of betrayal, failure, or abandonment, where you're forced to ask a question that shakes the very ground of your being. Do I even love myself? Not in the surface-level affirmations or mirror smiles, but in the raw honesty of solitude, shame, and silence. This isn't a question of ego, it's a question of survival. Because until you learn to love yourself more than anyone else ever could, you will be tossed in the waves of others' expectations, never anchored in your own truth. Stay with me through this message, not for inspiration, but for confrontation. Because what's waiting at the end isn't comfort, it's transformation. There is a voice within you that has never stopped speaking. It is soft, often drowned out by the noise of the world, but it has always been there waiting. This voice belongs to the child you once were, not the literal child alone, but the emotional, imaginative, intuitive being who knew how to feel without shame, who reached out instinctively for connection, who cried without apology, and loved without calculation. But somewhere along the path of growing up, that child was taught to quiet down, to sit still, to grow up. And so, the child learned how to survive, not by being true, but by being acceptable. Not by expressing, but by suppressing. This child still lives in you, not in the past, but in your nervous system, in your responses, in your longing. When you feel unexplainable sadness, irrational fear, or emotional triggers that don't match your current situation, it is often this child, trying to speak, not with words, but with pain, with loneliness, with unmet needs. The tragedy is that we often ignore this voice, labeling it weakness, immaturity, or instability. We distract ourselves, medicate ourselves, or criticize ourselves, unaware that what we are really doing is silencing a sacred part of our soul. To love yourself more than anyone else ever could, you must learn to listen to this voice. You must return to the place where the fracture occurred, not to dwell, but to understand. Because understanding brings integration, and integration brings healing. The inner child is not asking for perfection. It is asking to be acknowledged. It is not demanding that you fix the past, but that you stop abandoning yourself in the present. Many of the adult problems we face, codependency, people-pleasing, emotional numbness, are not adult problems at all. They are childhood wounds that were never healed. And these wounds become behavioral patterns, repeated over and over in the unconscious hope that someone, somewhere, will finally give us the love we never received. But no one can parent your inner child like you can. No one can offer the safety, the nurturing, the presence that your soul craves unless you first offer it to yourself. That is where the real work begins. Not in affirming your worth, but in protecting it. Not in imagining who you could be if others approved of you, but in accepting who you already are, even when no one else does. This means saying no when you're afraid of rejection. It means choosing rest when you're terrified of being called lazy. It means holding space for your tears without needing to justify them. It means allowing yourself to be enough without doing more, pleasing more, giving more. This is the reparenting process, the sacred task of becoming the caregiver you always needed, but never had. And it is not a passive process. It requires conscious effort, emotional literacy, and radical honesty. You must become fluent in your own emotional language. What does your sadness want to tell you? What truth lies beneath your anger? What memory is activated by your anxiety? These are not enemies to conquer. They are messages to decipher. Because every emotion, no matter how disruptive, carries information. And when you learn to decode these messages with compassion, you stop fearing your inner world. You begin to trust it. The tragedy of most spiritual journeys is that they bypass the body. But your inner child lives in your body. In the tightness of your chest, the clenching of your jaw, the heaviness in your stomach. You cannot think your way to healing. You must feel your way there. You must allow your body to speak the language your mind has forgotten. This is where you will find the fragments of your lost self. Not in ideology, but in sensation. Not in beliefs, but in embodiment. The breath that quivers when you say the truth. The tears that fall when you finally let go. The stillness that comes when you stop running. This is where the real integration happens. And as this connection deepens, something profound begins to shift. You begin to realize that the way you treat yourself sets the template for how the world treats you. This is not a metaphor. It is a psychological law. The boundaries you set with yourself become the boundaries you set with others. The respect you demand internally becomes the respect you attract externally. Life mirrors your inner relationship. It echoes your self-perception. If you constantly criticize yourself, you will be drawn to people who do the same. If you consistently neglect your needs, you will find yourself surrounded by those who exploit that neglect. But when you start to honor your feelings, to speak your truth, to make decisions from a place of self-respect, the world cannot help but respond differently. We often believe that changing our external life will change how we feel internally, but the inverse is true. When you shift your inner reality, the outer world rearranges itself to match. This is not magical thinking. It is alignment. When you stop betraying yourself to avoid conflict, you begin to experience peace. When you stop dimming your light to make others comfortable, you begin to attract those who love you for your brightness. When you stop apologizing for your needs, you begin to see them met, not because others suddenly become more giving, but because you stop settling for crumbs. And yet, this shift can be terrifying, because it often means letting go of relationships, roles, and identities that were built on your former self-abandonment. You may feel alone, misunderstood, but solitude is not punishment. It is a recalibration. It is a sacred space in which your true self begins to emerge. And as it does, you begin to understand that loving yourself is not a destination. It is a practice, a daily choice to show up for yourself, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. This love becomes your anchor. It grounds you when life is chaotic. It reminds you who you are when others forget. It protects you from the temptation to shrink, to betray, to numb. And in this grounded state, you no longer chase love. You no longer beg for what you're willing to give. You become a source, a wellspring. And from this place, you give not to earn love, but to express it. You share not from emptiness, but from overflow. This is the power of inner alignment. But perhaps the most beautiful outcome of this journey is not what you gain, but who you become. As you begin to love yourself fully, you become more human, not less, more honest, more vulnerable, more compassionate. You stop seeing life as a competition and start seeing it as a mirror. You no longer judge others for their wounds because you've made peace with your own. You no longer need to be right, to be liked, to be admired. You simply need to be true. And in that truth, you find freedom. This is individuation, the process by which you become whole. Not perfect, but whole. Not admired, but real. It is the path of depth over surface, of meaning over image. And it is not for the faint of heart. It requires courage, patience, devotion. But the reward is incomparable. Because when you live from this place, life stops being a series of reactions and becomes a conscious creation. You no longer drift, you choose. You no longer perform, you embody. You no longer abandon, you return. And in this return, you begin to see the deeper rhythm of existence, the sacred pattern that was always present, waiting for you to awaken to it. You begin to sense that love was never something you had to earn. It was the foundation of your being. That everything you were searching for out there was guiding you back in here. And that in learning to love yourself more than anyone else ever could, you are not becoming selfish. You are becoming sacred. Let me know when you're ready to continue into the next speech. Or if you'd like this converted into a transcript or voiceover script.